30 years into our democracy, a third of South Africans still rely exclusively on social welfare grounds with no salaried income in many South African households. And many South Africans, behind the face and the numbers of our poverty line, many South Africans continue to suffocate through the tyranny of poverty, homelessness and hunger. Tonight we ask the question, 30 years into our democracy, have we done enough to alleviate poverty in South Africa? Good evening, my name is Oliver Dixon. This is the last week of our focus on the economy and behind the unemployment and growthless economy figures that we've been reflecting on here on Democracy 30. We ask the question, are poverty-stricken citizens who suffer through the tyranny of hunger and homelessness being given due consideration? Tonight we ask, to what extent has South Africa managed to alleviate poverty since 1994? Joining us for this discussion is Lumka Olifant from the Department of Social Development, Isabel Fry from the Social Policy Initiative, and Ali Sablé, Project Manager at Gift of the Givers. But first, let's have a take a look at this insert put together by our producer, Joe Tugwana.
Upon pushing the door, I observed that she hanged herself. I checked the children in bed. I found an 8-year-old with a swollen stomach, and I turned to the 6-year-old, and her stomach was also swollen.
In 2023, some struggling mothers in the Eastern Cape were reported to have killed their children and themselves due to hunger. This is despite the existence of government social programs for the vulnerable members of the society and the indigents. In the past 21 years, the percentage of South Africans receiving social grants increased from nearly 13% to just over 39%. To date, South Africa runs one of the biggest social grant systems in the world, with 47% of the population receiving government social assistance. But for those who fall outside the social assistance system, surviving is a struggle on a daily basis.
I am employed. At least here I am able to find food and something I can sell to take home.
A 2024 UNICEF report says South Africa is one of 20 countries with 65% of all children living in severe child food poverty.
I work here. I recycle old plastic bottles and old perfume containers.
According to Stats SA's overview of hunger in South Africa, the country made strides in reducing overall hunger to 11% in 2019. But the latest General Household Survey shows that hunger is seeing a resurgence, rising to 15% in 2023. With food security remaining a challenge for many households, the Human Sciences Research Council report initiated in 2019 points to serious food scarcity in many communities in provinces such as KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape.
People are just using land for settlement randomly without taking into consideration that they need to be a land that is reserved for agricultural production.
With 6 years to go before the deadline to meet the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, it remains to be seen whether South Africa will meet the targets of reducing hunger and extreme poverty. Joe Tugwana, Democracy 30.
Thank you so much for being with us. We start the conversation this evening. Isabel, I want to ask you as an opening question, rudimentary but an important question. What does it mean to be poor in South Africa?
I think that's a very profound and important question, and it can be answered in a number of different ways. I can answer you statistically. I can tell you that for anyone who has less than 1,634 rand per month, they're deemed to be poor. But we could also talk about the relative poverty, about the fact that we have high inequality with a lot of people being incredibly poor and a very few being much wealthier. And so if you lack where there are people with a lot, then that sense of poverty is felt a lot more. I can talk about gender. I can talk about the fact that women-headed households are far more likely to be poorer. And also the fact that more children are raised by mothers, single mothers, than by joint, both parents or any other. So there's a gendered aspect. I can talk about youth. For people under the age of 25, the poverty is linked to unemployment, and that's profound. And so poverty robs people of hope. It robs people of a sense that there's a mobility, that they will be better off than their parents, because that sense of being without any ladder to go forward is important. And I think the point about social grants is really important. I know we are going to come to this, but I think that the South African government has recognized the extent of the crisis and has tried to set out the ground map of meeting people's basic needs. But we need to do something far more. Our crisis in South Africa is more profound than many other countries. We've got the highest unemployment, second highest unemployment, highest inequality. We're an upper middle income country, but we're not getting it right. We're not getting it right because what we're trying to do is drip down some kind of assistance. We need to be expanding the head count coverage, and we need to be expanding the value.
I want to pause you there because I do want us to come a little bit later on to ask the question, what should we be doing to alleviate poverty further? Lumka, 18 million South Africans, excluding those on the SRD grant, are social welfare recipients in South Africa in one form or the other. Many of them don't have a salaried income in their households. Has social welfare done enough to protect the most vulnerable in our societies, the most disenfranchised in our society, from the tyranny of poverty? Or are there ways in which social welfare can be expanded today still that can best protect the most vulnerable? Sorry, you just had muted yourself there, but go ahead, go for it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Certainly, when you ask the question whether it can be expanded, that is a definite yes. This is why the Department of Social Development is trying to make sure that we get into the policy of making sure that we have a basic income grant. And I think your guest there in the studio will tell you that the Department of Social Development has been on this and trying to make sure that we expand the social assistance program. Of course, it being the biggest poverty alleviation program in the country. When we look at maternity benefits, for instance, that we are also saying in the department that not only should we start with a child when the child is born, we need to start when the mother is pregnant. So yes, when you ask the question whether we should be expanding, if you ask anybody who is in the social security space, they will say, yes, there are still gaps. Tomorrow we are launching the Social Security Review during COVID, Volume 2. When it comes out there, it also tells us that we also need to expand to those who are informal workers, Social Security. It tells us that we need to make sure that those who are single-headed households, as your guest there was saying as well, that so we need to also protect those. But when you look at the 30 years of democracy, of course, South Africa is a better country since 1994. We're speaking about issues of gender, as we were speaking about earlier as well. We have had so many pandemics as a country, but we have still shown resilience. We had HIV/AIDS before, and we had to make sure that we protect people. Many international and world economic downturns where we were able to secure and cushion those families that are poor. We recently, COVID, if you compare with other countries, the South African government had the biggest social security program at that time, and also whenever we need to step up as a country, South Africans has shown, our programs have shown to be resilient. Of course, this is not only a social development program, it's a government program, as well as the introduction. We have said that there's human settlements in it, there's electricity, there's water, there's food insecurity, and all of these things are not just only for the Department of Social Development. The eradication of poverty as a program is a program of government.
Yeah. Ali, I want to bring you in here. You're on the ground dealing with people who you give humanitarian assistance to that are at the bitter end of the poverty, suffocation, and tyranny. What does poverty look like on the ground? And when you alleviate people's problems during times of disaster, you have to address oftentimes the most fundamental of their problems, the most fundamental lack that they have. When you face that, what does it look like?
Just to paint a picture for the viewers, on the 6th of August 2023 was our 31-year anniversary. On that same day, we received a call from the South African Police Services making us aware of a case in Toledi village in the Eastern Cape, asking our teams can urgently come through to assist the village. Our teams immediately left to go do the assistance, and when we came there, we found that a mother who could not bear the brunt of watching her children suffer of hunger anymore, she got a little bit of rat tax, she poisoned the 3 children, and when the third one was taking too long to pass on, she then took a knife and stabbed the child through the throat. She then hanged herself as well. Investigation, speaking to the village people and to the social development teams on the ground, they then informed us this mother used to go around every day looking for food for her children. And with that, the day the person came to knock on the door to come collect their money, the mother said she's coming back now, but the mother never returned. And when they went to investigate, they found the mother hanging. While our team was busy with assessments in the village, we found that 50% of the village children was malnourished. We then went to the clinic, and the clinic told us a lot of children coming to the clinic is malnourished. There is not any medicine to cure a child over malnourishment overnight. The only thing is nutritional programs of food. We then established a soup kitchen there. Over the past few years, Gift of the Givers had about 40 to 50 soup kitchens. Currently, we have 175 soup kitchens at key areas around the country. Not too long ago, when I was in Colesburg on the N1, I noticed young children walking along the N1, coming to the local garage, scratching in the bin, looking for food. I then asked them, it's dangerous, what you guys doing on this busy road? They then informed us, their parents send them out on the busy road as there's nothing to eat at home, to go scratching the bins looking for food. This was confirmed by the petrol attendants and the owner of the garage, who says on a daily basis they are quite scared as to these children can get knocked over just looking for food. And on a disaster site, in the past when we responded to a disaster, whether it's floods or fires, in the past the first thing when you get to a disaster site, people will ask you, where's the building material? We want to build our homes. Nowadays, when we get to a disaster site, the first thing they ask you, where's the food? Where's the food? We are hungry. So we can see over the last few years, the increase of hunger, the increase of poverty, and especially in the rural areas. You know, we run one of the largest soup kitchens in Touwsrivier. In the COVID-19 pandemic, the soup kitchen used to feed about 50 people a day. Currently, the soup kitchen is our biggest soup kitchen in the country at the moment. It's feeding 1,250 on a daily basis. But wow. we have established in the community, we're trying to encourage each house to establish a vegetable garden so they become self-efficient. Because we found many people especially the elderly, not being able to stand in the soup kitchen lines. And another point I want to mention is, when we were in the Northern Cape as well, the local clinic sister told us they are giving the patients the medication, but they're not understanding why they're not healing. They then went to the people's homes and they found out they're taking the medication on empty stomachs, prolonging them the healing process. The clinics are asking us if it's possible to start off feeding schemes or soup kitchens near the clinic. And nowadays, before the elderly people get their medication, they go into this feeding scheme to get a meal, then the medication goes through.
Yeah. Ali, thank you for painting that picture. I think it's an incredibly horrifying picture. And I listened to it, chills went through my spine and my body. And I want us to look at how common of a story that is in South Africa. We'll do that on the other side of this break. Don't go away. And welcome back to Democracy 30. Tonight we ask the question, have we done enough in democratic South Africa to alleviate poverty? We are in conversation with a fantastic panel, but before we go back to the panel, let's have a look at this graph that paints us a picture over the last 15 or so years around the numbers of poverty in South Africa, but gives us an indication of poverty along 3 different criteria and definitions. The first is food poverty. And that you will notice is below what is considered the lower poverty bound and the upper poverty bound in South Africa. poverty per person per month in rands has increased from what was less than 200 rand per month in 2006 to what is now required at just under 1,000 rand per month in 2024. I asked Isabel at the beginning of our conversation, how many people, how common is it and what does it mean to be poor? This paints the picture for us. For you to be considered food impoverished, you need to be making less than 1,000 rand per month in South Africa, food impoverished.
Yeah.
And that is a horrifying picture. Listening to what Ali had said just before we went to the break, Isabel, I perhaps want to ask you this. How common is this in South Africa, and has the picture gotten worse?
The picture improved until 2011, and after 2011, the picture, the poverty increased, and the attempts to alleviate poverty decreased.
Why is that?
Some would say that was the knock-on from the global financial crisis and the impact on unemployment. I mean, essentially in South Africa, poverty has two causal drives. The one, I would say, is the legacy from apartheid, where 80% of people, black African people, were denied assets and land. So the ability to make income from your own assets was denied. And then the second is your employment income, because that's where other people get income from. We're looking at an unemployment rate of 42.6%. So year on year, as the unemployment rate has increased, so people's earnings have decreased and the number of people in the households have decreased. You mentioned the increase of dependence on social grants, but what we've also seen is a decrease on the dependence on remittances. People used to go to towns to work, they would send money back to the family. That's decreased because unemployment has increased. And so we're in this narrowing situation, the straitjacket, where you have fewer people employed. The wage differential has rapidly increased. And so, in effect, social grants bring income to 43% of the households. It's not the sole source of income to 43%, it is to 30%. But that is an incredibly important lifeline, which takes me back to the point of the gift of the givers does an incredible job in terms of humanitarian aid. And social development bridges that gap to an extent. But what we need to be seeing in South Africa, and I'm glad you've done the session on economy after 30 years, because we need to be saying, how do we take people out of poverty, not just feed them in poverty, but actually move them into a more sustainable livelihood going forward. 30 years is 2 generations. It used to be 1 generation, but you've now got children being born into households where you have had no worker for 2 generations. And that's the kind of thing which is critical for, as children, I mean, you talked about the malnutrition, you've also got to talk about the stunting that occurs, the physical stunting, the mental stunting, but also when nobody in your community is that person who's gotten out, if the role models are few and far between. How do we look at that poverty of hope and future? I think that's really the challenge, because we can look at the poverty lines and the statistics are very, very worrying. But we also need to look at things that go beyond it. But also, for instance, the replacement rate. So your food poverty line of 796 rand, the lowest, that's what the World Health Organization says is the amount that you need to survive on. The child support grant is 530 rand. The social relief of distress grant is 370 rand, significantly lower. So while we are reaching people on head count, it's the ability to actually survive and thrive on that. And then the other point that we need to look at are the unintended consequences of some of the policies, like the means test. I think Lumka and I will talk about this at some stage, but if National Treasury says you cannot get access to your to your grant if you earn over a certain amount, that's disincentives. That's a disincentive to people to earn. So if you get a small amount, even the Bible says you get a talent and you're meant to make more of it. If you hide your talent, you get nothing. But if you use that talent and if you use that money from the social relief of the distress and use it to make more, after a very small increase, the entire grant gets taken away. That is not wise policy making. And I think it's that, as well as the fact that women often only receive grants because of their reproductive capacity as caregivers of children. Women have constitutional rights. We as women have constitutional rights, and yet sometimes it's only when people recognize us as child bearers. And again, the impact of that in terms of choices that very poor women have to make, it undermines your ability to make those choices because you don't know where the next meal is coming from. So government has done really well, but we really think if South Africa needs to elevate our status, in terms of unemployment, inequality and poverty, we need to be doing a lot more, especially with eyes on the G20 next year.
Yeah. Lumka, oftentimes when we think about social welfare protection, we ask the question, or we think about it from a money perspective. How do we get money into the hands of people so that they can provide for themselves and not die from poverty? But is it perhaps necessary that you ask a more fundamental question, which is, how do we ensure that fewer people go to bed hungry? And that is a question around resource management, around food resource management. Is that a question that the Department of Social Development has pondered on?
The Department of Social Development is the one department that is making sure that we advocate for all the things that our panelists are here. And I'm sure Isabel will tell you that we are all advocating to make sure that we have the necessary resources so that people have enough in their hands. And maybe the discussion now needs to move away from social development and go into employment and go into economics and go into treasury and all the other people that can be able to come together and be able to give us the necessary resources. I think when your producers came to me, I actually said to them, maybe you are not in the right department to speak about the alleviation of poverty, as I had said even previously, that this is a government program. So maybe we need to shift the conversation, because you've had the conversation with social development, you've had the conversation with social development changing policy, you've had the conversation with social development advocating for more money for NPOs. We've had the conversation with social development saying that we need to even increase and start with maternity benefits. We are having the conversation amongst ourselves. But now, maybe we are at a crossroads as a country to start saying, who do we now need to bring on the table?
Yeah. Ali, I want to ask you this question, and I'm certain you've thought long and hard about this question. South Africa surely produces enough food to feed everybody, but we've fundamentally failed to do so. Why is that?
Going into some of these rural areas, as Lumka said, it's not only social development's problem. Going into some of these rural areas, and especially into the farmland areas, you find many children still undocumented. And for them to get their grants, they have to have an ID, they have to have a birth certificate. And so it takes more than one arm of government to alleviate poverty. Speaking to some people in the villages as well, they said, when they go to the local clinic, sometimes the officials from Home Affairs is not present to document the child, hindering the process of the child getting a grant or the family getting a grant. Going into the school feeding scheme as well. There are some principals in the Eastern Cape, Northern Cape and Free State who reach out to us. They only receive a certain amount of budget to cater for those children who are documented, because this is the rules of government in terms of funding, etc. So, and this is not, 8 million South Africans are employed, cannot look after 65 million people, 8 million people's taxes. So we need the partnership of NGOs, of the private sector, the corporate sector to come together. It's not a problem of government alone. And one example I can give you is the area of Fraserburg. When the drought happened there, and farmers could not afford to employ the farm workers anymore. It had a ripple effect. The banks closed down, those people got unemployed. The major supermarkets closed down, those people got unemployed. And again, it led to a bigger problem where people that once could afford to put food on the table is now dependent as an extra arm of social development to provide for these families again. So we need all South Africans, whether it's NGO, private sector, to stand together, implement programs in these communities so that poverty should be not a cycle that's inherited in the family. And we should encourage everyone to take part in this initiative for a better country and to eradicate the cycle.
Isabel, there's no panacea to this, right? And I don't assume anyone has a magic wand, but if you had a magic wand, in what direction would you wave it to alleviate the fundamentally structural problem of poverty you described earlier?
We have mentioned my silver bullet before, which is not a silver bullet, but a universal basic income. This started out as an idea in 2002 with the Taylor Committee report. And at that stage, government decided that they would rather invest in public works. as a research institute, having looked at the levels of unemployment, having looked at the macroeconomic policy and the emphasis on inflation and debt, which cuts government expenditure, as Lumka was saying, one could hear the frustration in her voice. DSD has attempted time and time again to roll out increased value and headcount in terms of their grants. But it keeps on getting cut by the purse strings of National Treasury. We need to have Department of Labour around the table, recognising, in terms of a jobs policy, what is possible. Public works are great as an absorber. They are not permanent jobs. The private sector needs to come in. The recent jobs, the jobs target from the government and business partnership phase 2 that was launched 3 weeks ago, they're targeting 1 million jobs in 5 years as being their target. Now we're looking at 12.4 million unemployed currently, and the best that can be offered is 1 million jobs. Now if that is true, we can't tell people to wait for the job that's going to come. We can't say to people, you can get a grant if you have a job going through, the job seekers grant. How can we lie to people and say, if you get this job, you must go out and look for if you get this grant, a job will come its way. If you look hard enough, if you look strong enough. The jobs are not there.
Yeah.
So as a country, we need to be saying, and I also, you used the term welfare. I think we need to move away from the term welfare to development. I think putting income into communities allows that community to develop a kind of dynamism which we don't get from a sort of a top-down approach. It enables people to take control, to take agency. But we have to cross that line. We are not going to be creating those jobs immediately. In future we will.
Fortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. That's all we have time for. Lumka, thank you so much for your time. Ali, thank you so much for your insights and your work. Really do appreciate it. That brings us to the end of the show this evening. It's a very important discussion. You and I should continue it. You can find me on social media. It is on X, it is @Oliver_speaking. On Facebook, it is Oliver Dixon, or on @SABC News across all social media platforms. My name is Oliver Dixon. Good night for now.